Hi, and welcome to the I Teed Myself podcast. My name is Matthew Miniman, and this is episode 143. What can Bender teach us about compliance adherence? So, Bending Rodriguez. He is the culmination of so much robot. He is a character from Futurama, which, if you haven't seen, it's a cartoon show that off and on has run from 1999 until now. And it's created by Matt Groening and David X. Cohen, basically of Simpsons fame. It's an interesting cartoon show, and it really goes above and beyond with things like scientific accuracy, scientific jokes. It's a smart show about dumb people, and it is a cartoon. So, there's a lot of that there. Anyway, the whole idea around Bender is that he is a kind of the dude takes no shit. If you haven't ever seen it, definitely suggest it. And also, you're probably, I can imagine the Venn diagram of this show and Futurama being nearly a circle. So if you haven't seen it, what the fuck are you even doing here? Anyway, particular episode called Godfellas. Bender gets ejected from the Planet Express delivery ship and is shot out of a torpedo tube. As he's shot out of the torpedo tube, he basically becomes lost in space, eventually colliding with a bunch of space debris. In this space debris that he collides with, there are these small sentient creatures called shrimpkins that begin to worship him. They call him God because, they land on him and he's the biggest thing there. And so he decides to interact with them. He chooses a prophet called Malachi, and basically throughout his actions, he attempts to help them. Like he attempts to provide them with purpose by making them make him booze, and then he attempts to help them through completing miracles on their behalf. And really, in the whole grand scheme of things, he's not really doing a whole lot, but everything he does has a negative impact on these shrimpkins, and which is really bad because it really kills a whole bunch of them. He burns down buildings, he causes tsunami, he maims and gasses out others. So there's a lot of negativity there. Eventually ending up in where the Shrimpkins have a war of religion, which ends in a nuclear explosion and has no concept of the reality of whatever happens in the real world. Not at all. Nothing. There's no good metaphor there for what's going on in the world today. Anyway, the whole point throughout this whole thing is that after all of these folks, the Shrimpkins, destroy themselves on Bender's ass, they begin to, or he feels sad about it. He's like, oh man, I tried to do everything I could, and this is awful. Being God is terrible. And in his floating of space, he meets an entity that is says it is user-friendly and has compassion for all things. And, potentially could be the result of a space probe that collided with God. But, never actually indicates anything about what its total purpose is. But as they discuss, Bender and this entity discuss what happened. One of the things that the entity says is that you have to have a light touch, like a safe cracker or a guy who burns a building down for the insurance money. And on top of that, you really have to do things in a way where people aren't really sure you've done anything at all. And that is really kind of the whole point of compliance adherence. So one of the things that happened just very recently, I'm recording this on July 18th, 2026. And earlier this week, July 12th, 2026, the Department of War released a a notification that CMMC level 2 phase 2 or CMMC phase 2 uh, was being halted. They're going to delay it. They were putting it on a pause uh, because they had an intent to review and establish uh, some additional rules sets in there. They were trying to do some research. They in this whole conversation, what they did is they basically were like, the weight on small businesses is too much. The entire industry is suffering from this rule set, and we have to figure out a way to make this work. And so, I guess to explain the whole thing, CMMC. What is CMMC? CMMC is the Cybersecurity Maturity Matrix Compliance Framework, and it is a compliance framework that is handed down by the Department of War, DoD, whatever you want to call it. They basically hand down this standard. It's loosely based off of 800-171. I shouldn't say loosely. It's tightly based off 800-171, but has some additional control sets in there to identify exactly how you do things and to make sure that you actually prove that you do them. So it's a big departure from previous compliance frameworks that basically only ask you to validate that you do these things just by checking the box. This actually proves that you do it and collects evidence for it, and has a requirement for you to have it in a policy. It is not one of the most strict compliance frameworks as far as like, hey, you have to do this and this and this and this, because it definitely has it just has a requirement for you to address it. So things like, hey, do you have controls in place for removable media? It doesn't tell you what those controls have to be. It just tells you, do you have controls in place? And then asks you to display what those controls are. So, it's not so much like telling you exactly how you're supposed to run your business, but it is fairly robust in the fact that it asks you to make sure that you have a policy in place for these things. Now, the reason why this is a big deal is that without a CMMC compliance, you are not able to do business with the Department of War at all. Like, you're not allowed to have any interaction with the Department of War along the chain. You can't be a sub of a primary contractor. You can't be a primary contractor. You can't even enter the contract phase without this compliance framework. And the problem that the DOW kind of spotted really shortly before the compliance was supposed to be enacted is that they really felt that they didn't plan on the limited adherence amount or number to the compliance framework, because it turns out that less than 1% of the entire industry was actually seeking out CMMC, and there were a lot of reasons for that. One of them, and the primary reason, is that it costs about $40,000 to do an assessment, which is insane, especially if you're a small business who only makes $200,000 in gross revenue a year, because then that's eating away at a sixth of your profit every year, and it can make the whole thing untenable for you to pursue. So in order to keep afloat, you just, okay, I guess I'm not going after government money. I guess I'm going to go do something else. So anyway, the whole point here being that the DoD kind of said, no, DOW, whatever, kind of said, no, we're going to halt this. We're going to pause on this. We're going to keep a requirement in there. Now, what this means is, and to explicitly define this in the circumstances, this doesn't mean that companies shouldn't be following CMMC, because those that still have contract requirements for it still have to adhere to it. And they only paused phase 2 of the rollout, because phase 2 is basically you have to have this certification, you have to have this assessment done and be certified in order to do business. But phase 1 was doing what is called a self-assessment, where you basically self-attest that you are following the rules. And there's a bunch of freaking out about it in the industry where people are like, oh, well, this means that people are just going to lie and they're not going to actually do any of the work. And this is why you need the assessment to prove that people do things. And long term, it doesn't, there's no indication of what the Department of War is really going to do. You can have an opinion on all of it. You can have an opinion on the Department of War and everybody inside of it, the CIO, and definitely you're welcome to those opinions. But right now, there is no indication of what that means long term. So, what does this mean for compliance adherence? Well, one of the biggest barriers to compliance and adherence for any organization, big or small, is the fact that it can be extremely disruptive. It is extremely difficult to do compliance adherence. And unlike the shrimpkins that land on Bender's ass, you are never going to be thought of as God. In fact, quite the opposite. You're probably going to be thought as the devil when you're implementing compliance adherence for any compliance. And it's not because people don't want to do the right thing. It's that you're making a change. And if there's anything that people hate more than, cops, I don't know. People seem to hate change more than anything else. And even when change is in their best interest, we see this in every compliance adherence, no matter how small, how minute, no matter how insignificant the change may be, people just absolutely fucking hate it. They despise it. And so when you go in to try to start doing a compliance framework, people are going to throw a massive fucking tantrum about it, no matter the organization, until they realize how fucking easy it is that the change is going to be made and how little it's going to impact them. But making the changes causes friction. And that's where compliance adherence kind of falls apart for a lot of organizations, is they don't want to do compliance adherence because their people are resistant to the change. People are resistant to the idea that this is something that they should be doing or that they should be forced into or whatever. I know with some of my clients that I've helped through CMMC, their people basically, I don't know how else to say it. They acted like children when it came to change. Even if it was a small change, like, hey, you need to be using a password manager. Well, you can't tell me what to do. The government can't tell me to do this. This fucking bullshit. The government telling me making these requirements. God damn it. No, well, freedom, liberties, and whatnot. And it's like, well, you are more than welcome to not do these things. But then the government is also more than welcome to tell you to fuck off when you want to do work for them. So there's a give and a take there, right? Yeah. Maybe consider the money that you need to put food on your table. You having chosen the Department of War as a target industry that was a choice you made. And now if you don't do that, you're going to lose your income stream and your organization is going to suffer as a result. So all that being said, CMMC compliance looks to push that there. That's an example of it. But there are other compliance frameworks that do the exact same thing. PCI compliance is a compliance framework for the payment card industry. Literally, PCI stands for payment card industry. And the PCI compliance piece is the same way. If you don't adhere to the PCI compliance framework, eventually you're going to lose the ability to process credit cards, or you might have to pay a significant fee to the credit card providers to even process those credit cards. So, there's every compliance framework has something similar in their framework as a requirement. And there are reasons for it. It's to secure the information, it's to make sure that people are protected and that things aren't going to go missing, or, your organization is doing things at least at bare minimum in acceptable manner. So, when we talk about compliance adherence, this is completely for your organization. It can feel like it is like you've got no choice. It can feel like there is no other way to do it and that it's unfair. It can definitely feel that way. But you always have a choice of this. You can choose not to do these things. You just then have a more difficult time as a business to continue on. And sometimes certain contract requirements may be in there. There is a compliance framework out there called ISO 27001. This is a development-based compliance framework. It's a lot different from other compliance frameworks because there are very strict controls in there that tell you exactly the controls that you have to have in place for certain things. But there are other controls where it's very flexible. But it's all about controlling the data integrity and operational guidelines of a development organization, an organization that develops software. And it is very much a requirement for a lot of organizations to have this if they're going to be writing code as a third party for a larger organization, such as if you're writing the interface for a car manufacturer, they probably are going to require you to have 27001 before you can even get your foot in the door. So if you want to do business with them, you have to have this compliance framework. So what does this mean overall for adherence for everybody else? And, in the grand scheme of things, does it matter if you're adherent? Well, so the compliance frameworks out there are generally all of them are a collection of best practices. So you should be following them. Like, as an organization, you should be following them. In fact, going into CMMC as an example, a lot of organizations are like, we're already doing most of this. We just don't document it anywhere. And that's the point, is that you have to document it. You have to show that you're doing it to be compliant. And that's where that's one place where people can get hung up on. But honestly, if you're doing things the right way, compliance can be an easy thing to adhere to because you should already be doing these things. Now, if you are just totally balls to the wall, no, we're not going to be compliant to anything. I have one organization that refused any of the best practices because they didn't want to have to deal with multi-factor authentication. So they only wanted to use passwords. And those passwords had no requirements. They had no special characters. They had no expiry. They had no complexity. They just wanted to be able to log in all the time. And we dropped them. I dropped them because they were awful. And that's kind of what you should expect as an organization. If you aren't going to adhere to even the minimum of best practices, you should probably expect to not have people want to do business with you at all, especially when they find that out. So compliance frameworks really don't necessarily have a negative impact on your business because, again, if you're doing things the right way already, they aren't a big leap to get to adherence to. However, if you are following, or if there are aspects of your business where you're not following those compliance frameworks, it can be a massive disruption based on what it is that you need to change. And there's an endless number of examples of big changes that need to be made in an organization. But multi-factor authentication kind of is one of the biggest ones to highlight because it can drastically change the workflow of certain individuals, and it can prohibit the access of certain service accounts and identified resources where if you enable multi-factor authentication and you just let it go, it can really harm the process and workflow of your business. And it's most disruptive to the users, especially if they're not used to it. So enabling multi-factor authentication can be that one of those controls that gets really disruptive. But it is also a requirement across most, I'd say 90% of all compliance frameworks. So, if you're kind of in this position where you have a compliance framework that requires a control, it's not ideal to have to make these large changes. So then how do we do this as administrators or compliance people or, business owners? How do we do this so that way we can continue to run our business, continue to do our thing, but also become adherents to the organization? Well, some of these things are going to require big adjustments. Some of them are going to require some redirection. We do this because we have to maintain this for our business. We have to if we're going to be a business long term, we have to have this, so on and so forth. But ultimately, if you're doing things the right way and you're doing things correctly in the compliance framework, it's going to be pretty seamless to get from a state of non-compliance to compliance. And so always start out with that proper footing in mind. Or if you aren't there yet, look for ways to get there before you start your compliance journey, because ultimately you want compliance to be painless. You want the compliance aspect of everything to be like, yeah, we're already doing all this. We've already got all of these things down. We can just get the assessment. We can get the audit. We can have somebody check the box for us. So that way we can pursue the next step. We can go back to doing our thing, because honestly, unless you are a third-party assessing organization, you probably, your business is probably not compliance or making sure you're compliant to things. And so once you get yourself to the point where you are compliant, and you can just drop it and get back to doing what your business is actually about. So, ultimately you want to maintain that consistency across there, because you want your compliance not to be disruptive. You want your compliance to be like that pickpocket, like that guy who burns the building down for the insurance money. You want to have a light touch. You want to make sure that people aren't quite sure that you've done anything at all with the compliance framework. You want to make sure that it's as low key as possible, that it's not as disruptive as you can get. Because ultimately, if you don't, you're going to be like Bender, and you're going to have people screaming and dying, and probably going to cause nuclear war on your hands. And that's all I got time for today, guys. I hope you all have a great day.